So at this webinar, we're going to share stories, findings and learnings from the pilots of the Wellbeing Economy Policy Design Guide around the globe. And we're really excited to launch a brand new policy design portal today, which colleagues from Zoe will be showing you shortly. So if we go to the next slide, please, Anna, this is the flow of today's session. So got a very brief introduction now, and then you'll hear some presentations, starting with myself and Elizabeth Durth from Zoe Institute. We'll reflect on the global project and the shared learnings that have come from these 4 pilots. And then you'll hear in turn short stories from their pilots, from Jimmy in WEAll Scotland, Tara in Canada, Jeremy in California, and by video, because it's the middle of the night there, from Paul in New Zealand. And then we're going to have some time for questions and discussion based on what you've heard. And then Christine and Elizabeth from Zoe are going to introduce the new website to you, and there'll be more time for questions and discussion about the website towards the end. So that's how it's going to go today. And while you're listening to the presentations, please do think about any questions or comments that you would like to bring into the discussion section in the middle, because we would also really love to hear about projects that you're involved in, your efforts and work to bring wellbeing economy policy design to life and participatory policy processes. So really looking forward to that discussion with you all soon. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, and Elizabeth and I are going to give an overview of the project from a global perspective with some shared learnings. So these are the 4 locations in different parts of the world that have been working together since summer 2021 on these pilots. And when we started this journey last year, the intention was for these 4 pilots to bring the wellbeing economy policy design process to life as set out in the guide, the PDG, the policy design guide, which you can see the cover of there, and we'll pop a link to it in the chat if you're not familiar with it. That's a guide that was created back in 2020. And for us as the global project team of Zoe and WEAll, our goals were to connect the 4 pilots, helping them to learn from each other, make connections, and hopefully be bigger than the sum of their parts, and to hold space for the hub teams on their shared learning journey through monthly meetings, ongoing support, and to draw out learnings and stories to amplify along the way, and now that the pilots are coming to an end. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Thanks. As Lisa hinted at, Zoe has taken the lead on developing a suite of resources and templates based on the work of the hubs, really leaning into and listening to this learning experience from this process. And as part of this, we've developed a new website that can be an interactive journey to the policy design process. And my colleague Christine will take us through that as we're finally ready to share that with you all later in this session. This learning aspect has been really, really important, as this whole entire process has been something new, something experimental, something different, and something really, frankly, emergent. And that's been clear throughout the process of each of the hub's different stories and experiences. And we've really kept the question in the front of our mind: what can we take away for others who will experiment with this and explore this themselves? And hopefully that you all also experience, but this was the goal, that the site is designed to support that and everyone along this journey. Before we start to talk about the learnings, Lisa and I wanted to start with just a little bit of a brief reminder of what the Wellbeing Economy Policy Design Guide talks about, what it explores as the process for designing policy. And there's these 5 key pieces there. The first is around the vision. So where is it going? What is the North Star? How is this built? The second is around the strategy of, so what kind of wellbeing economy, or what is the strategy towards the wellbeing economy that's being built? What kind of policies are implementing this? How are these policies being implemented, and how are they being evaluated for their impact, and work around the process and on the way towards building a wellbeing economy. Within the guide, there's a number of case studies, tips, resources, and this is also explored and expanded on the website. And one key thing that we've learned along the way is, as is visualized here, this is not a linear process, and rather interconnected, complex, and all of the hubs have experienced that, as you're about to hear from all of them. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. And the policy design guide is all about how policymaking happens. So these design principles that you can see on the screen now contained in the guide are just as important as those 5 stages, and possibly even more important. And these are that policy making has to be goal-oriented, with policies designed to promote the well-being of people and the planet, participatory processes with diverse communities, contextual, recognising that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, experimental processes to encourage continuous learning, holistic, with the economy seen as part of and not distinct from society and the environment, and evidence-based, of course, and also strength-based, focused on achieving the positive aspirations of society and not just problem solving. So the 4 pilots were based on these design principles, so each was diverse and unique to their context. Unsurprisingly, though, many of the challenges, successes and learnings that they had were shared throughout the process of their pilot. And we've asked the hub teams to share stories to help illustrate some of these overarching themes that have emerged. And in a couple of minutes, you'll be hearing more from them about the importance of relationships and trust, taking a non-linear approach, as Elizabeth just mentioned, respecting safe spaces and meaningful participation. And in addition to these 4 key themes that you'll hear more about from the hubs, there were additional learnings for us as a global group that I just want to share briefly now. And crucially, it's become clear that it's difficult to confine what is a complex process into a time-bound project, which is what we asked all the hubs to do. All of the hubs felt the pressure, I think, of what we now see as an overly ambitious timeline. And we've learned that in this transformational work, we need to move at the speed of trust and plan accordingly. And next, we learned, sometimes the hard way, that the levels of commitment from policymakers will vary. And as one of the hub team members put it in a reflective chat we had recently, this commitment should be treated as contingent at best, even within the short timescales of these projects. Some people lost their electoral seats or their jobs in government, or the commitment that had seemed really strong came and went over the course of the project. And the importance of having deep buy-in from policymakers as champions of the process is really clear, and also that the commitment needs to be from more than one individual.
In addition to the 2 points Lisa just shared, all of the hubs also experienced the challenge of balancing this process of long-term systemic change and deep transformation with the need particularly felt by a number of community stakeholders or partners that are involved for the feeling of visible or tangible medium-term progress, and that this is a tension that each of the hubs needed to negotiate and balance throughout the process to address both of these needs and feelings at the same time. And lastly, one key reflection on the policy design guide itself and the process outlined there is that this experience really underlined and cemented the power of visioning work and how important that this is in setting up a policy design process, and that this is a necessary foundation for how any of this work can continue. And many of the projects delivered really powerful visioning processes, which helped to galvanize the community buy-in and stakeholders that were participating. And you'll hear a bit more about some of them as we continue.
Yes, so first we're going to go to Scotland, where I am as well, and to Jimmy Paul. And Jimmy's going to share insights from the Love Letham project on the theme of meaningful participation, which of course is central to the policy design guide and to all the projects. And just to add a note before handing over to Jimmy, because I'm based here in Scotland, even though I'm part of the global team, I've really enjoyed being able to get hands-on with Love Letham. And it's been a really powerful experience hearing children and young people, who are the focus of this project, clearly articulating what matters to them. The visioning work in Letham and Perth identified serious policy priorities, from the need for play, the need for stronger social connection, access to healthcare. And play or social connections, these might not be things that we commonly associate with the economy, but when they become the starting point for developing economic strategies and policies to deliver on these goals, we can begin to expand our understanding of what the economy is and can be. And I've witnessed policymakers learning that in real time from children and young people through this project, which has just been so powerful. So Jimmy, over to you to tell more about Love Letham with a focus on how participatory it's been.
Lisa, Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was a fab introduction. So I'm Jimmy Paul, the director at WEAll Scotland. As well as being the director at WEAll Scotland, I've worked in the children's sector in the past, grew up in the care system from the age of 11, experienced harsh poverty throughout my childhood, growing up in East London. And so, you know, I know at a very personal level, a very visceral level, why it is important that all children should be expected to be supported to grow up and should experience love in their lives. But the context in Scotland is a particularly tricky one. We know that 1 in 4 children in Scotland are growing up in poverty, and that is before the harshness of the cost of living crisis that we're facing right now will push many more into destitution. We know that we have fab intent and policy and legislation to address that, but it is not translating into action and differences in lived experiences. So we set out to make Letham in Perth and Kinross the best place to grow up. Why did we choose Letham? We chose Letham because Perth and Kinross, after inviting expressions of interest, put in an extremely strong expression of interest where basically this would be a full focus for them, and they were completely up for it at all levels of the organisation. Some of the challenges that Lisa alluded to around the commitment of local authority staff, given the pressures on them, did waver from time to time, but their commitment has been steadfast. So our aim was to make sure that Letham would be a fantastic place to grow up. And how did we go about doing that? Next slide, please, Anna. And again, thank you. So I'm going to focus more on the participatory nature of what we've done. Now, Laura Lundy spoke about the 4 kind of pillars of participation in order to realise UNCRC Article 12, which is making sure that children have a right to express their views and a right to have their views given due weight, so that it's not tokenistic. And there are 4 things you need to consider. There are space, voice, influence, and audience. And I'm going to take each of those in turn, talking to them from how we conducted this project. So next slide, please, Anna. Starting with space. So far too often in participatory engagement, especially in Letham, an area with high indices of multiple deprivation, children and families are asked to meet in places and spaces which don't feel safe to them. They're asked to answer questions that are already prescribed to them. And the sense of power is one that is secondary, you know, the secondary power of families to the system asking them the questions. And we decided, and we knew that we needed to flip that as part of our process. We needed to embody excellent participation to ensure that families felt like and children felt like equal partners in this process. So we met in spaces where people felt safe and able to share, often community centres, it might be schools, it might be any space in which children told us they wanted to meet. We made sure we adapted our process to their wishes. And that's important because we needed to make sure that we were sharing and seeding power, the power that we innately had leading this project. Voice. We set out to listen in whichever ways that people wanted to share their views, and people used their voice, as I'm talking to you now, to share their views. Children may have used songs, raps, poetry, Lego, Play-Doh. Some of the output, and you'll see some of the pictures on our Love Letham website, have been part of just one of the most unbelievably brilliant participatory processes I've ever seen, and I've seen a few really good ones. But we really embrace listening to children however they wanted to share. And often we know that there is evidence to tell us that enabling children to share how they want to, sometimes not staring at them and asking them a question, but being side by side, asking a really open question and letting them express themselves however they want, is a much better way to elicit deliberative discussion and deeper discussion. And the last thing on voice is making sure that trusted people, whether it's teachers or parents, could be present if children wanted them to be, to enable and enhance their involvement. Next slide, please, Anna. Audience. We needed to make sure that community leaders were in the room, that teachers were present, that multi-agency partners were present. Often that was the council, sometimes there were third sector involvement. We struggled a little bit with health sector involvement, but we're on the case. And also that WEAll Scotland were present. So making sure that there was the right audience in the room, and that links really closely to influence. So making sure that there's real weight given to what children and young people share. It's not this kind of extraction. Children often told us, and their families said, because of the nature and makeup of Letham, often people were parachuted into the community, extracted information and left once they had done that. And that was never our intention. The opposite was so. So we needed to make sure that change happened as a result. And the local authority and partners would be ready to adapt so that this, what we set up, would form a mandate. The children's voice would form a mandate for change and partnership working. Next slide, please, Anna. So what we've achieved so far, we've spent time with children and families and listening to children. And on that point I just said about not being parachuted in and then leaving, we actually adapted our original plan and built a children's commission. That is a group of children who come together, who explore and define what their key wellbeing priorities are and put those to the local authority and work in partnership with them to decide an action plan in relation to that. We also built an adults commission of community leaders. Next bullet point, please, Anna. You can keep these firing in, by the way. We agreed their wellbeing priorities. We agreed a priority policy issue, which was frightening and disordered behaviour. So the commissions agreed that that was the one that was most important to them. And the local authority is now expressly committed to reorienting its resources to meeting these wellbeing priorities of the Commission. So instead of what is typically a top-down approach to change, we've started to shift that through this process of using the policy design guide. Next slide, please, Anna. And I've said some of these already. Children and families locally have told us that this feels different from previous engagements they've had in a good way. There is a clear appetite to develop the work of the commissions further. And on that point, we're in the process of looking to secure funding for future work, which would help us go even more upstream. And we're looking at developing an infants commission. Again, we wouldn't have infants sat around a table trying to talk to them, but we would find ways to make sure that babies and infants' needs and wishes and the future generations thinking that is increasingly at the fore in Scotland is at the heart of decisions that are made by the local authority and how they budget. And there are many other local authorities in Scotland who are really curious about this approach, and we're in advanced discussions with one and tentative discussions with a couple of others about how they might use the policy design guide in their context and in their local authority. So what projects could they take forward? We also have a session in December with some of the most influential leaders across Scotland about how we can start to budget out with silos to effect significant change. So thinking in a collateral cross multi-agency way to make sure that we're meeting needs and that budgets are shared rather than limited within silos, which is a key issue that we've unearthed. Next slide, please. I think that's the last slide for me. Hey.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy.
No problem. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Jimmy, for sharing the story about the work in the Love Lesson project. I know that Jimmy has to shoot off for family obligations, but Lisa will stick around for Q&A for what's happening in the Scottish context and how this project has gone for those that have questions from Jimmy's story and presentation so far. I would like to next hand over to Tara Campbell, who's been leading the hub and the work in Toronto on behalf of the David Suzuki Foundation and WEAll Canada, and she'll focus specifically on the centrality of relationships and trust building as part of her process. So go ahead, Tara.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody. I'm Tara, and as Elizabeth said, I work at the David Suzuki Foundation, which is a Canadian environmental charity. And through our Wellbeing Economies program, we're spearheading efforts to establish a WEAll hub here in Canada. And today I'm going to share a window into part of our pilot project in Toronto, which was called Toronto Imaginal Transitions. So as you might be aware, the policy design guide from WEAll is deeply centered around this idea of participatory policymaking, meaning that policies are co-created with residents and stakeholders who are implicated. So we started our pilot with the goal of building a community network in Toronto that would explore, experiment, and advocate for economic transitions in the city. My co-facilitator, Cheryl, and I started by bringing together a group of 12 core team members with a variety of different interests. And while none of them used well-being economies as a term when situating themselves, they were all working in their own ways for economic and societal transition in the city. We were inviting them into a design process where we touched on visioning, strategy, policy co-creation, and implementation, all in a messy, entangled way, which I think you'll hear more about that sort of complexity and nonlinearity from the California hub shortly. And as we approached these processes, we kind of came to understand that relationships are the foundation for doing them in a way that isn't just performative. And a lot of our work in Toronto ended up being centered around forging these relationships amongst our participants, which interestingly wasn't much of a focus in the policy design guide at the time. And so I'm going to speak really just about this theme of our learning today. So we decided to center relationships in our process because they endure beyond temporary projects and allow for self-organization. The relationships are there when a project ends and can be leveraged in the future, and people can start building their own collaborations and engagements through the relationships they build. Relationships also allow for deep feedback, grappling with power, and a safer space for experimentation. When participants trust you and each other, they can more easily share what they want and what isn't working. And relationships are prefigurative of a well-being economy. We want an economy that is relational, so we need to be relational in our processes of working toward it. You can read the report that we published a few weeks ago to learn more about how we were going about building relationships, and I'll share a link in the chat when I'm done speaking. But for now, I'll just show a few photos so you can start to get a feel of what Toronto Imaginal Transitions was like and how we tried to prefigure well-being economies by designing our processes with relationship building in mind. So Anna, you can just kind of flip through these photos, but I'll just share that we had fun together, we ate food together, we designed for intimacy and magic, and we invited people to join us on this kind of unusual, intimate journey. If you keep going, Anna, there's a picture, I think in a couple of slides that shows, yeah, right there on the right, that's one of our previous city councillors in Toronto who's cooking with my co-facilitator, Cheryl. And what I'd like to emphasize kind of to end off is just that we found that relationship building isn't just a phase or the first phase of the policy design process, but an ongoing practice of care and maintenance of the social fabric required to design, influence, and implement policy. So I'll put, I think Lisa probably put the link in the chat, but I'll add it again if you're curious to check out our sort of in-process report to learn more, and I'm happy to connect about this too. And I'll pass it back.
Thanks so much, Tara. And as Tara hinted at, one of the key learnings that we reflected on from the experience in Toronto is to explore a bit more deeply how relationships with stakeholders and this process of building trust is important for the entire process of the policy design guide, and have also added a section and resources related to this to the website to build on this key learning from the experience in Toronto. So thanks a lot, Tara, for that. Now we'll go over to California, where Jeremy will talk about the experience and the nonlinearity of the experience in Pomona. So take it away, Jeremy.
Thanks, Elizabeth. My name is Jeremy, and I work with the Institute for Ecological Civilization and help to lead the WEAll California Hub. The WEAll California Hub worked with a local nonprofit called the Latina Roundtable to pilot the policy design guide in the city of Pomona, California, which is in East Los Angeles County. Our process was certainly not linear, and I think that's one of the remarkable things about the policy design guide. It was designed with the recognition that the process isn't always a straight line from start to finish. In Pomona, we worked on aspects of the vision, strategy, and policy assessment in ways that overlapped. And one of the reasons for this is that we had an opportunity to apply for federal funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. So as a result, while we were in the early stages of engaging community members in the visioning process, we were already thinking about a particular strategy for community wealth building that could be funded by the city as a part of COVID relief. At the same time, the city council member with whom we work closely had a chance to pass an emergency rent relief act that could lead to a more permanent policy on equitable and affordable housing. So of course, we jumped at these opportunities. And we tried to weave feedback and reflection on these programs and policies into the process of co-creating a well-being vision with the community. So in our community engagement sessions, we gave just very short and simplified explanations of what we were proposing to the city, namely a community wealth building project in the form of ideally one or more worker-owned cooperatives. And we asked community members if they thought this particular project would be a good strategy for achieving the kinds of things that they want to see in Pomona. And what we got back from community members was really a pleasant surprise. Not only were they positive about the potential impact of a community wealth building project, but they also generated more ideas around what kinds of cooperatives would best support the community. So in this way, the early stages of our strategy actually helped to jumpstart ideas in the visioning process, which in turn has contributed more energy and I think new possibilities to the strategy work. For instance, community members came up with the idea of using cooperatives to support local artists or to create a community kitchen for street food vendors. So I think our learning is that you have to enter into this sort of non-linear process with a bit of faith that it will all work out, or at least with the flexibility to shift strategies if things don't ultimately align with the community's vision. But in our case, the various stages of the policy design process actually came together in really remarkable ways. We are looking forward to moving ahead with the community wealth building project. And we're also really grateful that we've been able to help influence emerging policies along the way. And with that, I'll hand it back to Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, for sharing us a bit of insight into your experience with the communities that you've been working so deeply with in Pomona. Now, I would hand over to Paul in New Zealand, except it's the middle of the night there for him. And so we've recorded his contribution already, and we'll play for you now a short video. Paul is one of the co-founders of the WEAll New Zealand Hub, and this New Zealand project has taken the form of a case study which explores the historic and ongoing work of their Maori community partner. And Paul's video will explain a bit more about what his team has learned from working with them and how this helps to enhance the policy design guide and policy process. So I would hand over to Paul's video now. I think Anna's just trying to get the sound working right. Give us just a second.
Apologies, folks. I think we're struggling with Paul's video and the audio there, so we'll share that with you as a follow-up instead, so that we don't spend too much more time on that now. The best laid plans of trying to include the voices from everywhere. It's just a little 3-minute story, but you also can find in the link that I already shared in the chat the learning report from Te Hiko in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which I would really encourage you all to read because they've been doing fantastic work. And just to finish up our presentation before we open up for questions, I also wanted to share in the next slide some of the words of wisdom from the Hub teams, just to close this section on learnings. sharing some of the examples of words of wisdom that the Hub teams have shared with us that resonate the most. So Anna, if you could share screen again. So we'll get these to pop up and just give you 30 seconds to read these direct quotes from the teams taking part in these pilots and some of the themes that are emerging. Okay, and just on the last slide before we open up for questions then, if we just move on. As you've already heard, supporting participatory processes is not easy, but it was worth it because in creating this policy design guide more broadly beyond these pilots, the broad-based ownership of this guide has rippled out in ways that we could never have imagined. The policy design guide has reached a lot of new audiences who tell us that it makes economic system change feel possible, and you can see some of those listed here. And the fact that it's being integrated into economic syllabuses used by international development organisations to think about new definitions of development, used by city and national governments, these are all remarkable illustrations of the moment in time that we're in, and recognition that we really need new political and economic systems to build a more just, kind and sustainable world. So these pilot projects you've just heard about today have already made an impact, not only in the 4 communities where they're taking place, but at a national level in the 4 countries and with policymakers in other places who we've been engaging with every step of the way. And best of all, the pilot phase is at an end, but none of these 4 pilots are ending. They're not pilots anymore, but they're all continuing in some form. And I would just like to thank all the Hub teams who've worked so hard and embraced complexity to deliver these fantastic projects. So we'll stop sharing screen now, and we've got 10 minutes or so for questions or comments or stories that you have from your own work. So please feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand, and let's have a bit of a conversation. Yes, Sandra.
Yes, I would like to know, reading the policy design guide, why there isn't much more focus on education. You know, we live in a technological age and we are still human. And so we have all these physical needs that must be met, not to mention psychological and sociological. And at the same time, we need to deal with very complex systems now, algorithmic systems. And, you know, unless you teach children how to meet their needs and how to deal with the complex urban societies that are now, you know, basic normal life, they get to be adults, young adults, and they're overwhelmed. So it seems that laying a foundation of how you take charge of your own well-being early on would be basic, but I don't see much emphasis on that. It seems like the focus is on what people do as adults, aside from, you know, getting children to talk more and take more authority in their own wishes and so on. But they don't have the information, literally the physical information, scientific information, financial information. They have no perspective to bring to the table because they're so young. And so I don't, it just seems like there has to be a focus on a different kind of early education. I offer human ecology because, you know, it seems to be a term that's been adopted by universities, at least in the US, but it's still not offered in the lower grades. So I think that there should be some consideration for that missing element in schools.
Thank you, Sandra. And I'd certainly agree with you that reform in education at all levels is absolutely necessary to build towards a wellbeing economy. I think for this particular process and the policy design guide, it's primarily aimed at policymakers in the first instance in the policy process. But what I've also been super encouraged by, as I said briefly, was the Love Lethem project is the only one of these four which was specifically focused on children and young people. And we engaged with children as young as 3 and 4, up to young people of 17, and over 25% of the children and young people living in that community. And actually, what's very, very clear is that they know exactly what's needed to live well and to thrive and to have a sustainable future in their community. And they articulated it very eloquently and really surprised the policymakers and the adults who were listening and analysing that data. So one of the new resources that we've launched on the website is guidance for doing visioning work with children and young people, specifically based on the work that was done in the Scottish pilot, because you're right that the policy design guide as it exists now, it was written with adult audiences in mind, but because one of these experiments has focused on younger audiences, we've been able to add to that, and we'll be updating the policy design guide with that next year as well. I know that there is a bigger question about education and education policy, but we've tried a design guide at a level that means that any policymaker in any department or any specialism can take it and make sense of it and apply this process, rather than it being about the specifics or the what of any particular type of policy. But I would love to see it applied to the process of education policy development. I think that would be a really interesting experiment. We've got another couple of questions here in the chat, and Kelsey, you're asking about disrupting national narratives, which is something else that WEAll certainly tries to do as an organisation. But I wonder if any of our hub teams or my colleagues here would like to say a bit more about narratives, not least because I've been talking too much already. Simon, do you want to answer that question about narratives, or did you want to say something else?
No, I had a question. I had a question, so I can. I'll wait if someone wants to respond to that.
No, okay, I'll keep talking then. I just didn't want to keep steamrolling on in case anyone else had something better to say. It is another work stream that WEAll has around narratives, and certainly I would say that these pilots, one of the really important things about them is that they offer storytelling that helps to shift the narrative. So to speak about Scotland in particular, because I'm here and I've been able to talk about Love Lethem with other stakeholders, being able to tell the story of this project where the council, the policymakers are really there working with children, with community, and they're coming up with an articulation of what a wellbeing economy looks like, and they're bringing this policy process to life. So it's not just a theory or an idea in a guide anymore. That is acting as a narrative that is, as Jimmy said, pulling others to want to follow, and a bit of a race to the top, to be honest, with local authorities here in Scotland. And I think that storytelling from practical projects and pilots like this is so important in that, as well as other types of narrative work that WEAll and other partners are trying to do about the need for system change. But just to focus specifically on what's come out of this, that would be my reflection. If nobody else has anything else they want to share on narratives now, I'll go to Simon for your question.
Thanks, Lisa. And I mean, just on that, I think what's really powerful is that the whole conversation around narratives is about the alternatives, the alternative systems, and this, this tells a story of alternatives are already out there. They're viable, they're working, they just need to be taken to scale and learned from. And I think that's a really powerful shift in the narrative in terms of there are no alternatives, we're stuck with this kind of thing. So that's really positive. It's really positive to hear these stories. But I do have a couple of questions. One is, it feels like trust is the essential glue for all of this, and I'm reminded of the research done on social capital and everything, and yet trust in institutions and processes is kind of at an all-time low, and so how to ensure to get that trust built in at an early stage, and on what level of trust are we actually sort of trying to build these processes? So just if there are any reflections on that, I think that's important, given that trust seems to have been eroded in general with both institutions and processes. And the other question I had was, so what happens next with these pilots, and then in relation to other initiatives that have expressed interest in in learning and tapping into this learning?
I can jump in a little bit around the trust question, and just sort of speak to some learnings from our project in Toronto, where we were really we kind of set out with that as a goal at the beginning around building trust, and also had the intention to have city and institutions kind of more closely entangled with the process. But then learning from all of the folks who are participating, we found that kind of bringing that institutions and policymakers in too early was actually not a good idea in order to build trust in the kind of community network that we were working on establishing. So we're still kind of thinking through that, because there is this sort of tension around bringing them in and around when the timing happens. And we've kind of introduced some folks who have kind of more trusting relationships in the community into the group. But it's a really hard thing to work through. And I think throughout the course of the pilot, we kind of shifted our goal a little bit, which was more so around building the strength of a community network that could imagine different institutions or different, really imagining different kinds of institutions that are needed, and less so about kind of at the start focusing on engaging with policymakers and asking them to change their institutions. So we just kind of shifted our process because of that. And I think that we haven't necessarily resolved this question or have a good answer for it. I think we still we do want to engage more deeply with current institutions, but it's it's definitely a big tension that I think all of our projects have dealt with.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. And we're going to have to move on to hear about the site, but just to say briefly to your second question, Simon, we are actively fundraising for continuation of all the projects, but some of them have part of that funding already from local government partners, from the previous funders, and they'll all continue in some form, funding or not, because they exist now, and the work with the community organisations can't just disappear. And also to very briefly address the question that came from Roger about other levels of policymaking, national, multinational. These are very local projects, but we want to start with very tangible and local projects working in partnership with local government and amplify up to other levels, and also take the learnings to policymakers at all levels, which is a really nice transition to hand over to Christine to talk about the site, because this website we're launching today, it's an interactive journey through what was already there in the policy design guide, but also features lots of new resources, and it's very much aimed at policymakers at any level, and we really want to be reaching them with this resource. And over the next year, Zoe and WEAll are going to keep working together to do that. So over to Christine now to share this exciting new site with you.
Just wait for the screen share to load. Thank you. Okay, there it is. So as mentioned already, as part of this project, we've added an additional feature to our existing Sustainable Prosperity website. So this site already has the knowledge hub that you can see on the top, which is about the why of holistic policymaking, and a policy database under that policies tab, which is for the what of good policies. And then with this project, we've added this new area on the how of policymaking to really bring the policy design guide to life. So this is a screenshot of the homepage, and we'll share the link in the chat also to the site. So while the site was based on the policy design guide, we also incorporated learnings from the hub's experiences. And as this journey is nonlinear, as some of them have mentioned, different groups will have a different starting point, and this could be difficult to identify when you're just starting out. So we put here a few ideas, suggestions of how to start this depending on where you are in your journey. So if you're really just starting out and have no idea where to, oh, sorry, can you go back? Thank you. But have no idea where to start, you could start with laying the foundations and building those relationships as we talked about before. Or if you have been doing this for a while and you want to assess whether policies are working, you could start with evaluation, and depending on how the evaluation goes, go in a lot of different directions. And maybe you've put together a team but don't know where to go from there. So then we suggest starting with a vision. Okay, I can go next slide, please. So you can also navigate through this process however you like and decide for yourself where the best starting point is. So to do that on the site, you can click either this yellow circle that you see on the left, or under this policy design process heading, there's this explore button, and you can also click on that. And either of these buttons will then open our navigation tool. So that is the tool you see here. So a limitation of the PDF form in general, which is the form that the original policy design guide took, is that a document is inherently linear. So you open up page 1 and then you read page 2 and 3 and so on. So the order you decide to put the pages in sort of already prescribes a journey to take. And so what we would try to do here is really capture that idea of a nonlinear journey and allow it to be and to feel more dynamic. We also created, based on the feedback from the hubs, this 6th chapter, laying the foundations, which you might notice if you know the policy design guide is new. And that's in the top right corner there. And then that's on building relationships and stakeholder engagement, which, as we've said, is a really essential part of the process. So we've added some more guidance there based on feedback from these hubs experiences. And if you click one of these teal ovals, you'll go to the page for that chapter. Those are the 6 chapters of the guide. And then also each of those chapters has some sub-chapters. So if you hover over this oval, then it will, the sub-chapters will then appear, and you can also click on those. So you can start wherever feels best for you. And we'll go now to a chapter page looking at vision. Thank you. So on a chapter page, you see the purpose of going through the step up at the top, and also the pieces that make up this step, which are then the components below, which are the sub-chapters that I mentioned before. And in the future, we also hope to add a bit on the hub's experiences that they've told you about today on this page, but we don't have that content yet. So now it's just a bit of what this step is, what it, in this case, is to develop a well-being vision. And now, if you click on one of the components below with read more, or if you open again the navigation tool with the yellow circle, which would be in the bottom right-hand corner, it's not in this screenshot, but it is on this page if you visit the site, that will then take you to the components. So we'll go now into one of these components for crafting and communicating your well-being vision. Thank you. So this level, this sub-chapter level, is the real meat of the content, I would say. So again, we have a purpose, as well as a guiding question of what you should be asking yourself while you're doing this. So in this case, what is your well-being vision? Is it shared, and by whom? Then we also have resources, which are these squares you see at the bottom. So the yellow are templates that we've created based on the hub's journeys with their input and feedback. And there are 15 of these we've created throughout the site. And then the blue are links to external resources and tools that you can use to help. And then here's 2 examples of some templates. So some of these are PDF form, which are then meant to be really printed out and used with your hands. They're meant to be really tangible, or just downloaded and typed into. But you can see here on the left, the comms planning tool or template, which is a PDF. And then here's one of the pages from inside and what that looks like. So it's kind of a hands-on workbook sort of feel. And then the right is a monitoring and evaluation PowerPoint, which gives you some tips on how to then create a workshop based on this topic. So there's some of these on every one of the sub-chapters. These are just 2 examples. And then still on this subchapter page, if you scroll down past the resources, you'll see case study examples for the relevant step, as well as tips. So we've added over 50 of these examples from around the world, which we hope to make concrete a bit some of these concepts by going through these really case-based, place-based examples of application of this kind of step in the journey.
I think that's all that you're planning to share from the site. Did I hope I'm not cutting in before you're finished. I think so.
No, that's the end. I think
super. So as I shared in the chat, you can access this site and make use of all these resources already now. They're available and ready to use, the materials from the different hubs experience, other materials that we've created as part of the process. And I wanted to just open up in our last couple of minutes to ask if there's any questions or any reflections on this as a resource that any of you would like to share, having seen this compilation of the learnings of the project so far. Yeah, David,
you did. Yeah, thank you. Congratulations. There's a lot of work here, and it's not easy. And you've done a tremendous job. I salute you all. And most of all, I salute you for starting from the bottom up. So that, I think, is absolutely key. Having been involved in sustainability movements locally for 25, 30 years now, I've thought a lot about how you take small initiatives and scale them up. And I've written a book about that. So a lot of what you're doing is exactly that. The question that I have is actually about scale, right? So I think it's appropriate that it starts at a grassroots level and that learning starts at a grassroots level. But what is the vessel, what is the container for ensuring that the people who are involved are feel as though their input is appropriate, feel that they have a space where they can speak their truth and not be dissed or be accepted. So that, because it's in starting that group and then being able to replicate those groups, always pushing down, always using subsidiarity, right? The decision making is at that group level, and then sort of coordinating it at the community level and so on and so forth. But so it's really important what you're doing. What thought is there towards about the methods of communication and meeting together?
Thanks, David. I will answer this really briefly from our perspective, which is that not from the hub's perspective. And I would just give perhaps one of the hubs wants to also speak to this question. I know some of you grappled with this during your process. I would say on the topic of scale, for us, being able to capture the stories and build something that others can use was an important part of thinking of how does this become bigger, how is there more momentum, how is there an increasing diversity and number of regions that are taking this work on board. And for us, the site is an important part of this because of the way that it can help support other processes happening. That's not directly answering your question, but related. And I would maybe then ask if anyone of the hub teams wants to touch on this question as well. Do you have something to add? Or Lisa?
Yeah, and I can kind of do this with the WEAll Scotland hat on a bit, rather than from a global perspective, because we've been thinking about the role of a WEAll hub in this as an organisation that is set up to convene together different actors and to hold spaces for conversations about system change. So our hubs, and certainly for the hub here in Scotland, this Love Letham project has proven the concept to an extent of doing this process with multi-stakeholders in a very local area, so in one part of one city. But as Jimmy mentioned, we're now seeking to replicate that, but we're also, we've had the local authority officials that have been involved in that process speaking to national government about it already, and we've been able to influence national policy with the learnings that have come from it already through advocacy work. So scaling and amplifying has been part of the project all the way through, but now that we're getting to the end of the pilot phase, it will be even more possible to do that, because we're able to look at it. It's not the end, but it's a moment to step back and be able to take stock and draw enough learnings from it to pull these outputs together. The Scottish output will be published next month, but and I will share the link again. Toronto, California, New Zealand have already published those, and now we as WEAll and as Zoe, we can amplify those and try to make them useful for others. But I don't know if Tara or Jeremy, Tara's posted here in the chat as well, a response on that too.
Yeah, that's good.
Tara or Jeremy, did you want to come in before we start to wrap up? We're coming close to the end of our time. Jeremy, go ahead.
I could just really quickly say we're thinking of scaling really in terms of replication. So looking, we're actually having conversations even later today with local nonprofits that work in another city in California who might be interested in piloting the same kind of process. So obviously making that contextualized to that particular local setting, but we were thinking about sort of that replication rather than scaling it to larger regional governments as this next step. And then hoping that, collectively, once we are able to do this kind of process and help cities in different parts of California work through this piloting process or design process, then that will sort of build momentum to take it to a larger level.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And I can see, Tara, that you responded a bit in the chat, so thanks so much for that. I would then bring us to a bit of a close for now. So conscious of the time and don't want to keep you all too late. So just on behalf of both the Zoe and the WEAll teams, thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. We hope that you've gained some insights from the experience of designing policy for wellbeing economy from the Hub's experience. And certainly for us, this has been a really exciting project to be a part of and really interesting learnings to take away for how we bring this work forward. We can only encourage you to make use of the site that we've shared, all the resources there, and please feel free to reach back out to the WEAll or Zoe teams if you have questions, if you feel like there's something missing there that you would like to see, please let us know. We would love to hear your feedback. And I would just lastly say that the outputs from this project are not quite over yet. There's a few more pieces coming out from the hubs, as well as a tactile, practical version of some of the templates and the canvases that will be distilled down into a bit of a playbook or workbook that can be used as well. That's a bit more distilled than the site itself. And I know that the WEAll team is planning to reflect again on the policy design guide and look again at how some of these gaps and learnings are brought into that document. So, and of course, we've also got many further ideas and questions and inspiration to take forward to bring this work to even more places and to expand its influence into how we shift towards the wellbeing economy. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was lovely to see you all, and please stay in touch on these topics. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.